Hey everyone, welcome to the fight site. If you clicked on the thumbnail, I assume you know that. What you may not know is I'm Sriram. I haven't been here for a bit, but I'm honored and humbled to be joined by one of the striking coaches at the New England Cartel. You may know them for coaching top five bantamweight and featherweight Rob Font and Calvin Kattar, respectively. Jake Mainini, thank you for joining me, Jake. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, it's a pleasure. If you enjoyed Calvin Kattar's last performance, which was one of the best elbowing performances I think we've seen in MMA, this is the man to thank. So this is, it's awesome to have you. So I guess we'll start out with that since I brought it up. And one of the cool things about having a specific discipline coach is that you can really get into specifics, which is kind of why we made the site. So it's really cool to have you here again. So my colleague Ben Cohn talked to a New England Cartel head coach Tyson Chartier about a weekish ago, and he mentioned that they brought you in to talk about these sorts of specific tools, not just the boxing, but also the elbows, the knees, the kicks. And I'm wondering, since we've seen the elbow show up in Calvin's fights a couple times now, like 4 fights in a row, he's had at least one cool elbow moment. I'm wondering what really made you hone in on that as a tool that Kattar could use? Because, I mean, we noticed it's super versatile for him somehow. Like, he started using it and suddenly he was one of the best elbowers in the world. So what made you really notice that?
So one of the things that coming into the picture a little later, you kind of give these guys, some of our earlier days, you give these guys the layout. This is what I'm good with. This is what I think you guys would be good with. Let me know what you think. And as you develop a relationship with these guys and trust sets in, these guys will lean into one thing or another, or maybe sometimes several things. And elbows is one of the things for Calvin. I think Tyson and I, and even from just an outside perspective, knowing that Calvin's a power puncher and he has some tactful entries, nice. Eventually, guys are going to get either too close to him so they can't get putting it so far away that he can't touch him. So we need to have a plan B. On top of that, and especially in a sport with 4-ounce gloves, you can and will break. How often you break hands, who knows? But it is always, a little more on the safer side to have a backup plan. If you break your hand in that first right hand you throw in the first 10 seconds of the first round, you better have a backup plan. That's never an excuse to lose a fight where you have access to all 8 limbs and all the grappling and stuff like that. So not only to inflict more damage, but also sensibly to give these guys something else to throw just in case anything nasty like a handbrake occurs.
And that showed up really useful right away, right? I think it was the Ige fight. He broke like both hands, something like that. So yeah,
no, he didn't. He didn't break both hands. But actually, it's funny to bring up the Ige thing. But if you look at, so Calvin's big, his coming out party for his elbows, Steven's fight, right? The big skipping in that for the elbow. When you have somebody like Stevens who's notorious for being able to take shots, getting hit in the head with a hand is different than getting hit in the head with an elbow. When you say somebody has an iron hand, you're usually referring to their ability to take strikes, but mostly punches. Things change when you hit with an elbow. Now, when we're working elbows, we're thinking elbows, we're thinking cuts. We're not necessarily thinking knockout shots. Cuts change the way people fight. Cuts scare the shit out of fighters who have never been cut. And when you get a Jeremy who, we were doing video, I don't know that he suffered any major cuts. Nothing major there. And then you look like a Giga who fought kickboxing rules. So if there are any cuts, it was from a punch or an errant headbutt, setting out, but those, fog less often than say your average Muay Thai fighter. So throwing these elbows too tactically so that you're cutting people versus landing was two very different. So biggest thing with Calvin, again, with the handbrake like that, but having the ability to throw these things fearlessly. Not everyone who throws elbows throws them like Calvin does. I mean, that man is throwing them like he's throwing a football. He's looking to take your head off. And sometimes, man, even at the highest level, that can scare the shit out of people. That can really make them change the way they think about engaging. And no, Cal didn't break both of his hands in the Ige fight, but with guys like Dan and Giga, who tend to lower and almost duck when they're being punched versus a left fighter who may slip and keep that frontal facial structure right there. You don't want these guys punching the top of their heads. That is how you get the handbrakes. It's 9 times out of 10 you guys breaking the hands in 4-ounce gloves. Why are we touching the punching the top of the head? Hit them with an elbow, give them a little slice, let the blood run in their eyes. If we don't get an early TKO, like the rest of that fight is awfully tough for them.
Yeah, because actually I was wondering, because since you mentioned how committed people throw these elbows, one thing that was really striking about Kattar in the Giga fight specifically was that it wasn't just like these super hard committed elbows every single time. Like I'm wondering how much easier it is to teach someone that sort of coherent, sort of nuanced elbowing skill set when you already have someone like Calvin who, A, you know, the high guard sort of enables the elbow to start with, and B, you have someone who's so comfortable in the pocket, slipping and rolling shots that they can set that sort of thing up. Like, is there a big difference between teaching such a comfortable pocket boxer versus someone who's just, you know, showing up and doing the usual MMA thing of throwing elbows as hard as they can when they see an opening?
Yeah, so it's the same with when we're talking about boxing. With the 4-ounce gloves and the higher percentage chance of breaking your hand throwing a power shot. With the boxing small 4-ounce gloves and the elbows, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's not necessarily the one haymaker of an elbow you're going to feel it's going to knock somebody out. You have a much higher percentage of cutting somebody with a short and sweet elbow, just like you do giving somebody a puffy eye, raccoon eyes, or busting the nose with a short, quick jab. And you see that a lot with Rob. Rob just peppers guys, and all of a sudden they come back to the stool, and because like the way the camera is, and they're running around the ring so much, they sit on the stool and their face looks like hamburger. Like, what did he hit him with? He didn't hit him with a power shot. It's 17 jabs in a row. I mean, that is the, in my opinion, probably the guiding factor when we're teaching these guys or working with these guys, when we're building game plans. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. It is very easy at the higher level to lose because you're only throwing bombs. And you can see that maybe a little earlier in Calvin's career. But now you saw the change after the Zabit fight where it was like, hey, volume wins and you have the ability to throw volume. But once you're throwing volume and these guys brace for volume and that big power shot comes through, okay, now we have to think about two things. They're worried about the power shot, but also only drowned by the volume. And then you just create this nasty blend that guys get stuck in when they fight Calvin. Giga didn't know whether to duck or to keep a high guard because he have 2 or 3 punches. And that's where you need to keep these guys. They're always it's like I'm cat and mouse game the entire time.
Yeah, I'm actually really interested that you mentioned the Zabit fight. This is actually a question from one of our patrons as well. We saw after both the Zabit fight and even after the Max Holloway fight, Calvin making some really specific adjustments, not just in terms of tools or anything like that, but in terms of how he treated the space in the ring. Also, like how he built off the front kick, that sort of thing. You saw a lot of really different things from Calvin. I'm wondering how you as a coach sort of address weaknesses specifically, where like, for instance, like in even the Stevens fight, for instance, you could see like Calvin giving up space a lot more freely until he got his range, where against Giga, he was in his face from the beginning to the end, knowing that he had to do what he had to do. So I'm wondering how you sort of address those sorts of broad sort of, I wouldn't say weaknesses, but sort of give guys a strategic focus where they previously didn't have as strong of one.
Yeah, so I actually learned a lot of this stuff when you approach these concepts with fighters from Tyson. Tyson has, and he's gonna pull this out of his pocket next time we're arguing. Tyson has done a lot for me in terms of coaching style, being able to approach fighters in a more tactful manner, and be a little straightforward is not the word. Be a little less bull in a china shop when you talk to these guys. So when we're talking about fixing larger, broader concepts with these guys, because footage is so readily available, one of the best things that we can do is offer them instances where this concept has failed and where this concept we've seen success. And that honestly is the best, probably the number one way to do this. The way you frame it verbally, and that's going to depend on your relationship, your trust level with the fighter. And there are some things that I might put through Tyson. He's the mouthpiece until, or as my relationship with these guys grows. Don't have the convenience being their only coach, their longest coach, like I do with my Muay Thai fighters. 90% of my Muay Thai fighters, their first and only coach was me, and then also a crew builder guy who owns the gym. And I know them from the day they learned to wrap their hands to the day they fight for their first world title. It's one of these things where I had to come out of my comfort zone to understand how to work with these guys, and Tyson has helped me do that. And now that we're doing this stuff at the highest possible level, you can't mince words. You have to be very, very clear what your intentions are when you have a conversation about, hey, you give up too much space too often. Sometimes it's just framing it a different way. Sorry, my dog's trying to get in this. He's very interested.
Hello.
When we're talking about high profile wins and losses, it's a lot easier for these guys to digest this stuff. And Rob and Calvin specifically, and all my fighters are, all the guys that I work with are, but Rob and Calvin are very, very open to suggestion and are willing to talk about things. I've heard some horror stories about some fighters who just put the hand up the second you try to help correct them. I'd like to think me and Tyson are tactful when we talk to these guys. We're very what they want to hear. So it's been, but I don't want to say nothing but sunshine and rainbows. We're pretty damn close.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I was also wondering, because we saw in the Chikadze fight, even compared to the Holloway fight, because you've been with them for a couple of years now, but given the layoff that Calvin had after the Max fight, we actually saw a couple of looks that I'm used to attributing a bit more with Rob Font. You know, the consistent pressure, grabbing off the jab with that like little jab hanger thing that Rob does all the time. The playing off the front kicks that we saw him do against Cody Garbrandt, lots of really cool things. So I'm wondering, how much do you expect that sort of layoff? Like, obviously it isn't great with the circumstances physically, but how much do you expect that sort of layoff to help in terms of learning new things as opposed to just being in camp for someone specific all the time?
Yeah, that's great. I love a good chunk of time off in between fights. I understand, like, you know, your other factors like financial needs and wanting to stay in people's good graces and all that stuff. But I like big, fat 6-month layoffs in between. And it also really helps because Rob and Calvin aren't in one of our sessions where T, myself, some coach are running. Those two will be in the driveway just holding mitts for each other, and they will play each other's strengths and weaknesses. You know, we just had we had a sparring night last night. Rob was sparring as we had the Cheeto fight, and teams there and we're doing our thing. And it's funny, not only from our sparring partners who are part of the greatest performance, starting to see a little Calvin influence with elbows and back fists and stuff like that. And then, like you said, with the pressure, sometimes it's and again, going back to what I just talked about with where T knows exactly how to say what and when. Sometimes it is as simple as, hey man, Rob does this, and I know you can do this. Why don't you try it? Let's see what it looks like coming out of your stable, all that stuff. Go back and forth. And again, that all comes back to having the relationship with these guys. That's number one. Yeah, I'd say that's the biggest thing. And it's incredible with those two and how they're so responsible for each other's success as well as their own. It's really, I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, I mean, that's honestly like when I'm listing the fighters I like, I kind of have to lump them together because they're so similar. It's fun to compare and contrast them, but they're like, it's honestly one of the, in terms of like camp success, even because in general, like if you look at smaller camps, it tends to be that there's one real pound for pound tier talent, and the rest of the guys, they're not bad necessarily, but they're not as similar because the guys that show up, like for instance, if you look at like SBG, you have like Conor McGregor show up as the striker, and if you look at him as the model for all the other guys, it's like they tend to be grapplers. So I guess one thing I'm wondering is, what would you attribute having two really similar guys in one very small camp compared to like ATT or like Jackson Winker, those like in one fairly small camp, who are both among the best in the world at two of the best divisions? Like that's consistency that you really don't see all that often. So I guess I'm wondering, what do you attribute that to?
I think it's a number of things. And it honestly goes back to when Rob and Calvin were coming up in the regional scene, and Tyson, instead of pitting them against each other, suggested they should train with each other. Like at that instant, in my opinion, and this was well before me, that both of those guys and their mentality and their mind state either grew or changed completely. I mean, it is by no mistake that those two are as good as they are and having been so close to each other. And our next two guys coming up, Tom Palirulo and Nick Frey, same thing. To be a cookout, a girl, talking, everyone's having a good time, and they're shadow boxing and rolls in the corner. A lot of camping, forcing growth, encouraging growth. It's a lot easier when it's just a little condensed bubble. Everyone holds themselves very accountable. It's a room full of trying to outwork each other at any given practice. And that even goes between me and Tyson. And it's not like a dog eat dog kind of thing. Like we'll definitely help each other out if one person is the weaker link in the moment. But the checks and balances group is very intense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, so I guess we can go to Calvin's sort of future. I guess, first of all, before that, I was also wondering sort of the matchmaking thing, because if there's one thing that I'm known for kind of being annoyed by, it's featherweight matchmaking. It's kind of annoying to me that 100% of the time. So, yeah, I mean, you can. So, I guess my wonder is, so first of all, with the Giga fight, was there any sort of hesitation on you guys' side about taking a fight fairly low in the rankings when guys in the top five generally don't seem to be doing that?
No, just because of what a traffic jam 145 is, and we realize that it's not, I don't think it's like any malicious style of matchmaking or any sort of weird stuff going on in the back. It's just what it's going to be. It is what it is. There's always that traffic jam in the top three, and there's always some foolishness going on in 4, 5, and 6. It is what it is. I remember when we were talking about like incoming prospects and how we might have to fight down after the Max fight. We had thought and we had heard that it was Brendan Allen, and we're like, okay, it's definitely a fight that favors us. It's fine. We're fighting down another hype train. There is the juice is worth the squeeze there. I'd be lying if I said I prefer to Brendan Allen over Giga, only because if we can get Calvin another boxer who gets hit a lot, that's couldn't get any better. Couldn't ask for anything better. And a tall one too who stands up straight. Perfect. Or our other option is the tall world-class kickboxer. Well, I'm going to go with the boxer. Lo and behold. The more we broke down film with Giga and the more we talked to some of our other coaches in our sphere, I was like, no, Giga's the fight. Calvin 100% can work on this kid. And it is what it is. We got Giga. We're probably going to run into Brendan Allen, which is absolutely fine. In hindsight, like I still kick myself in the ass. I've had conversations with T leading up to that. I was like, hey man, like if we have the option with Brendan, I think it's a great shot. Giga, we obviously don't turn fights down. This camp doesn't turn fights down unless they're like absurd fights. Those two dudes like to fight. Cal Rob like to fight. It wasn't a lack of faith. It was what was the smarter move. The thing T taught me really early is there are good moves, there are bad moves, and there are smart moves. And we should always be searching for the smart move. And I thought Brendan was a smarter move, and turns out, listen, it is what it is. He was too injured. We got getting smashed again, and it did wonders for Calvin.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think you could come at this from another way, right? Because Calvin, at this point, he has 3 wins in the top 15. I think the only guys matching that are Max and Volk at this point. And more interestingly, his the win he got before Max, like 6 wins in a row. The win he got last time, 7 wins in a row. And now he's gunning for Arnold Allen, who has 9 wins in a row. So it's really the place where win streaks go to die at this point. And with that, I guess I'm wondering, how often are there talks of Calvin like fighting up in terms of like the logjam of, Korean Zombie getting the title shot off a guy Calvin's already beaten, or Yair Rodriguez sitting out for 2 years and then stepping into Max for some reason? I guess, like, is there any sort of leverage that you guys have in terms of talking to the matchmakers, being like, our guy is maybe the most consistent guy below the top 2 at this point?
So, T handles all that stuff, and I just listen when he talks, and every now and then. Company man isn't the right word. You can say that Calvin's a company. He fights. The kid likes to fight. He likes to get in fist fights. He likes to do them on TV. He likes to do them when they're not on TV. It doesn't matter. Is that a detriment? No, I don't think it is. Because that whole sitting around and talking shit until you get your chance kind of thing is not Calvin's gig. It's not Rob's gig. It's not the Cartel's gig. It's not the New England thing. We don't do that stuff. You get asked to fight, you fight. If there's a paycheck, if there's a little bit of notoriety, you fight. That's what we do. That's what this area does. Is that leverage? I saw this was on Reddit. Some people were saying this will come back to bite Calvin in the ass because he's so ready to fight anybody anytime that they're never going to let him crack the top whatever. And that's wrong, because if they knew better, they wouldn't keep throwing hype trains to Calvin. Maybe it does pay off. Maybe it does. I have a strong feeling it will pay off, because I think if we do fight Brendan, after Brendan, he's undeniable. Calvin's undeniable at this point. Whatever's going to happen up top with Max Volk, Yair, and Zombie, and Ortega and stuff, it is what it is. We can't control that. It's not even worth dumping any energy into it. We just continue to do our thing, move forward, and then when we get the next call, we get the next call. We get ready for that call, and we just rinse, repeat.
Of course. So I guess after we've gone through all that, it's probably more interesting to talk about the matchups. So you mentioned that you watched tape for Arnold Allen. You saw some stuff in him. And honestly, I've been interested in Kattar versus Allen for a bit because, as you mentioned, it's another guy who isn't necessarily the most attentive with his defense. But there's a lot there, right, in terms of guys who, at least for Arnold Allen, someone who's sort of built to annoy an orthodox jabber in terms of being a really hand-fighty southpaw who likes to leg kick. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what sort of specific things are you thinking about in terms of dealing with this? I wouldn't say necessarily unique challenge, because basically everyone Calvin's fought at this point has been trying to kick him at least a little bit, but the sort of, at least a really dimensional sort of challenge in terms of moving around and being annoying to get into the pocket.
So Arnold Allen puts himself into bad spots more than he finds himself into bad. Like, he does not come out of exchanges safely. He relies on the speed just a little too much. And honestly, a lot of his success is built off of being a very explosive southpaw. He does have some variance in his techniques. He's got that annoying little southpaw calf kick. I'll throw that left high kick every now and then. But his left hand is made of glass. His chin is up on the way in and the way out. But he's athletic, and he's young, and he's tough. Calvin is the type of patient that breaks Brendan Allen down. You know what? I thought it was going to be Hooker and Allen. I thought it was going to be Allen one-way traffic for the first round, and then Hooker was going to do his thing where he just stalks and wears you down, and then walks through one shot to land one hammer. Unfortunately, Dan got caught, and that is the getting ready for Brendan Allen, is that he does have that. But without our game plan is to never test chins. It doesn't matter. We know the Calvin stuff, and he has a chin. That's not something we'll never base a game plan off of that in a million years for any of our fighters at all, Cal. But I think walk down pressure, eventually Brendan Allen finds himself in a really bad spot. It's a great fight. It's an absolute banger, fan favorite for sure. And I, without a doubt, I'd say it's the most exciting potential fight in the near future for that division for sure.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like I was watching Arnold Allen before the Hooker fight even, and I was wondering, because a lot of Allen's like defense, it tends to be like sort of ducking down and shoving guys away half the time, and I was wondering how that interact with the knee. And honestly, Calvin has that uppercut that he does a whole bunch, so that could be fairly interesting. I guess the other thing that's a little bit worth mentioning is Josh Emmett, because he's on a 4-win streak, and I think he's with the because Calvin mentioned he wanted to be back in June-ish, and Arnold Allen, he doesn't tend to fight on that quick of a turnaround. I don't know whether it's like the thing he wants or it's a injury thing, but he did mention that June would be a tiny bit inconvenient. So if it turns out to be Josh Emmett, what have you seen with him in terms of a Kattar matchup?
Same thing. So yeah, we had thought before the Hooker and Allen fight that we were probably going to start getting ready for Josh Emmett fairly soon. And Josh Emmett is an annoying, with all due respect to Josh, it's an annoying fight. You got to look for the power shot, and then there's that wrestling shit, which is fine. I think it's a great opportunity for Calvin to show his wrestling defense. And it's the same. It's like Ige, but with a greater potential with the power. It's just got to be a smart, safe fight. Calvin gets to show his calculated side, in the wrestling component, which I enjoy the sport. I enjoy all aspects of the sport. But why wrestle when you can just knee people in the face? I don't know what to tell you. It's fine at the end of the fight, but I honestly think the UFC is going to hold out for that fight.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, because I think it's an interesting sort of contrast, right? Because with Giga Chikadze, you want it to be marching him down at all times because he's such a long-range threat. But with Josh Emmett, it's almost like you want to be turning back into the Kattar that fought guys like Chris Fishgold or Dan Ige, which was neutral space jabbing and drawing out the counters and getting behind your shoulders, that sort of thing. So, I mean, it's a really interesting question in terms of preparation. So I was wondering what you thought about that. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a couple interesting options going forward for Calvin, actually. But yeah, Rob Font, another super interesting fighter, I think. So starting with, I guess, where we started with Calvin, the thing that really interests me about Rob Font is he's got this sort of really unique sort of clinch game. where a lot of it sort of builds off his jab. He does a lot of grabbing and framing off that. He's been doing that since at least the Douglas Silva-Andrade fight. But I'm wondering, did you see that, and how were you able to build his game off that? Because it's better than ever.
Rob given the space to be creative. So it's one of the most fun experiences I've had since coaching any MMA fighter that matters. That Rob, a very old school traditional Muay Thai brain. He came originally started training out of Muay Thai, doing his MMA and stuff like that. But Rob, when you're giving him, like, let's say we do 10 rounds on pads, the first round we'll flesh it out, right? One attack, one off the attack, and then one fake off the fake. So blocks, thing crazy. I don't want anything nuts there. And Rob runs the show. I catch pads freestyle. There's no talking. Maybe we'll call it something here or there. He mostly leads the dance. And he's given the space. I'm the blank easel, and he's given the space to do his thing. He'll figure out if it works. He'll figure out if it doesn't work. One of the coolest things that I've seen when holding freestyle pads for a fighter, especially an MMA fighter who's got a lot of other things on the plate, is that he will play cat and mouse with me. He'll take one of those concepts we talked about in the earlier rounds, and he'll kind of rep it over and over again. And when he sees me, he'll sprinkle it in now. He's moving around. He's just touch the pad. He'll sprinkle it in. And when he sees me kind of getting ready, like let's say it's an inside leg kick after an overhand, yada, yada, and he sees me catch the overhand and I go to reach down for that inside leg kick, he'll bring that kick up top and he'll pull it right before it hits me. He is getting wise to me, getting wise to him. And that's why in his fights, he's able to make these adjustments fast. So in terms of going back, a lot of the stuff with Rob and giving him the space to be creative, if we're talking about the clinch game, a lot of that stuff is some of his natural instincts. And if there's like a big safety issue on an entry or an exit, maybe there's something game plan specific and we're in that range, we'll stop and correct it. But otherwise, he's driving the car. He's throwing specific strings, a couple of the same entries, a couple of the same exits, and then on a dime, he'll switch it up once he sees me get used to seeing that stuff, and I'm catching it without calling for it. He'll change it up on me. It's fun. It's almost like a game attack. It's really, really cool. We obviously don't like post a lot of the pad footage and the sparring footage, but it's very much a thing where guys will stop and watch. I have this with a few of my other fighters, but to watch Rob do it, it's poetry, man. Poetry. It's really, really cool.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's what's so cool is both Rob and Calvin, their last two fights, or at least their last fight, like both of their fights, I guess, is they were facing these, more highly touted strikers, I guess you could argue, at least in one specific discipline, and they went and wrecked them over 5 rounds, just making adjustment after adjustment off fairly simple tools, which is, I think it's really the sign of both a well-coached fighter and just a very skilled fighter, something that you don't really see all that often outside of championship caliber guys. But yeah, it's super interesting. I guess going back to Rob versus Jose Aldo, there was a ton of things to like from Rob in that fight. But I guess I'm wondering, and this was also a question from one of our patrons, how do you handle that sort of loss where someone does like everything right? Basically, like Rob came in with the right strategic idea for the fight. He did a whole lot of great tactical things. Mm-hmm. He was there for 5 rounds. He was durable. He was conditioned. But, the margins turned out a little bit too thin. Like, how do you move forward from that sort of fight and improve?
I mean, number one, you stop and you celebrate that fight. That was a tremendous fight. He looked so awesome. We're super proud of him. It is a bitter pill to swallow, but it honestly, I mean, we stopped for maybe a second and then we moved on from it. You really, this is the time when you pour over the footage. We pride ourselves in looking at the wins and the losses from the wins. I mean, the footage on these guys' wins has more of a chance to improve on their games than any of their fights that they lost. Usually we have with close fights, losses, yada, yada, yada. You also have to take into a component. We're not going to rest on our laurels and say, oh, it was Aldo. Very few people have beat him. Rob beats Aldo 8, 9 out of 10 times. I would bet my bottom dollar on that. What was the X factor? Was it something Aldo had, or was it something we weren't doing? And we have to be honest with ourselves. Rob is very self-aware. He's very open to being talked to about this stuff. Again, harkening back to earlier in the interview, as long as you're framing it right. I genuinely think that night was just Jose's night. I genuinely think it was just Jose's night. Rob did everything correctly. It was just that power differential. Rob is standing there with 45-pound champ. I mean, it is what it is. We run that back. I put my bottom dollar on Rob again. Biggest thing is to celebrate that loss. That was a loss worth celebrating. And I think when Rob gets back in there, you guys are going to see what it did to his psyche. I think it honestly, it did some good.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen before Rob's come off not losses, layoffs, losses too, but just generally when he comes off something that's not just a win, he comes back very, very strong. I guess I'm also wondering because the Aldo fight, it's sort of interesting because it was sort of played for like sort of a trivia bit before the Garbrandt fight that Rob started at like 21, 22. That's when he started thinking of fighting. Tyson mentioned in the other interview that he's just like a natural jabber. I think it's kind of easy to understate how impressive that is, just because it's like the sort of thing you hear at super bad divisions, like guys just showing up at 22 and just being an elite contender. But he's done it at like the best division in the sport. I guess I'm wondering, how has that impacted coaching, if it has? Because like the man's apparently just a prodigy somehow.
Yeah. So actually, T and I talked about this last night. His natural jabbing ability is, we don't have to touch it. He still works as a boxing coach. I still hold the jab, but a lot is just being able to build on that and a lot of other things. There's a lot of it that people really haven't seen yet for one reason or another. But making sure that he too much on his jab, he played that he's got to do more than jab. You got to meet him in the middle. It helps that his hand is the size of a small bowling ball and his arm is as long as a freaking grapevine. He's just genetically built to punch people that way. It is what it is. But Rob's mental is his greatest attribute. He's a prodigy in that sense. Is that he's creative, he's inventive, he's tenacious. A lot of those things are just guys just don't have, even if they have the body and the potential. That brain thing is Rob's strongest component for sure.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think that's also one thing that's super impressive coming off that the loss before Aldo to Rafael Assunção is that we saw, like, it's actually kind of interesting because at UFC 220, we saw two guys try to deal with Rob and Calvin sort of reactively in Burgos and Almeida, and Rob and Calvin sort of smoked them for it. And we saw with Renato Moicano and Rafael Assunção, it was a lot more proactive, a lot more dealing with the jab. And yet right after that, we saw Cody Garbrandt try something similar with Rob Font, and Font just didn't let it happen. Like, not just with being able to pressure behind the jab, but with the game off the front kick, the leg kicks, all that sort of thing. So I guess I'm wondering, I guess this comes back to the big concept thing, but what sort of specifics do you guys take away from a loss like Rafael Assunção, for instance, where it's sort of I don't know how to call it. It's just, I think Rob mentioned after the fight, it's just a guy who's always in position. It's something pretty interesting about that fight. It's just dealing with that sort of thing proactively, as in a larger strategic sense.
Yeah, same thing. And I spoke about this earlier. Being able to call back on footage, being able to frame this stuff and show them exactly what it looks like when you do something correct and exactly what it looks like when you do something wrong. These guys, they're learners. They're always learning. They're always seeking knowledge from other fighters, other coaches. I mean, and that's never, there's no intention of keeping those guys in the box. They will pour over their own footage and they'll bring it. Hey, what happened here? Why did this look like this? What can we do to stop this? The biggest thing, man, is that understanding that, like, where they're at is not the top yet. There's still room to grow. There's still room to learn. There's still room to evolve. There's still room for me and T to be better coaches, for John to be a better coach, Sean to be all this stuff. We're all consistently growing and evolving. And the worst thing you can do when you see it all the time is when you take a loss like that, is you fix that one thing that caused the loss. There's always more than one thing that causes a loss. You have to look at the other branches in the tree. And we cut the whole fucking tree down and edge apart to figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, I remember after that fight, Rob said that he's not losing another decision off his back, and then he fought Ricky Simone, and it turned out that was true. So just crazy work. But yeah, let's talk about Chito. So we heard, I think it was like a week or two ago, Rob's booked with Marlon Chito Vera. Kind of an interesting fight in terms of, like, just how their skill sets are constructed, where they both seem to operate in very distinct areas. Cheeto more of a sort of an outside kicker with not awesome work in the pocket all the time. But what I'm really curious about is the clinch, because both guys look like elite clinchers for the division. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what are the broad strokes dynamics that you see with Marlon Chito Vera against Rob?
So Cheeto's kicking range, he's not even remotely on the same planet with Rob at boxing range. And then in clinch range, when he's initiating, he's a force. But he only has 1 or 2 tricks when he's in there. Where I think Cheeto is the best is when he is creating a scramble and responding to stuff on the ground. The kicking stuff is very rudimentary. It's worked for him. Great. But I don't think it's a high-level kicking game, and I don't think it's a high-level kicking IQ. The setups aren't necessarily there. He throws a lot of them with no real setup, and it's more of like, I'm throwing this and I'm going to throw, which is great if your opponent stands still. That ain't Rob's line, so that's good. He's going to have to go back to the drum for that one. Cheeto does. It's tough because you're always like a fan of these guys and their coaches before. And then when you get the contract, fuck these guys. They're all trash. We got to work our way through. Fuck them. The handshakes and hugs afterwards, for sure. But before, that keeping Cheeto in that boxing range is going to be the most important thing. And again, like I said, his clinch is good when he starts it, but that's about it.
Right. And I'm also wondering, because Cheeto, one thing that pretty much everyone knows about him is that he loses every single first round, basically. Aside from Sean O'Malley, basically, he's a fairly slow starter. So I guess I'm wondering, with that sort of opponent, is it more of an instinct to sort of keep the volume going over all 5 rounds to just like stay consistent because he's going to come on strong later? Or is it something more like, we know Rob can hit super, super hard. We just wreck his high guard until he dies in 2 minutes? Like, what's the sort of look there?
No, I can honestly say, just even as if I was just a fan of Rob Font looking from outside, wouldn't know that's not how he's going to first round. Rob can sprint, Rob can hit you those big hands, but is it worth it? And this is the fun game we get to play as coaches, but we have to really pour over the footage exactly how strong Cheeto comes on and when, and what happens when he has resistance in those 4th and 5th rounds. This is, when people say that fighters turn it up later in the fight, usually talking about a 3-round fight. So with a 5-round fight, with Rob having a number more 5-round fights under his belt, I'm personally on paper, I'm willing to go in that last round, and his turning it up, I don't think is anything before. You're crazy if you think that Rob won't get down against anybody. We play the cards right, and we're smart. We're smart to the, sticking to the game plan, and we're smart with our exchanges. No, I think it's a playing field in terms of like intensity and tenacity in that last round with Rob, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, because we saw at both the Garbrandt fight and the Aldo fight, like, although there was a great deal of urgency coming out after that 4th round into the 5th. And Garbrandt, I think I had like 10 sevens for a 4 and 5. It was crazy work.
Christ,
yeah. 4 was like the most aesthetic round I've seen ever.
Rob's
crazy work.
Snowball. Oh man, when he gets going hill, that snowball grows. It's tough to be behind on him.
Yeah, so those are 2 super cool fights. I mean, I guess that's pretty much all I had for this one. So you mentioned a couple other guys coming up. I'm interested in hearing about them. So
Tom Palirulo and Nick Fiore. Nick Fiore just got himself the 155-pound combat zone championship. He fought a tough Brazilian. I think it was Nicky's 4th or 5th fight, and it was his 5th fight. And Brazilian was 8-4 coming out of BTT, hard calf kicker, pretty typical Brazilian style, all power, a little less in the defense, more on the big right hands, big right calf kicks. And Nick, I mean, when Nick gets you to the ground, it's you're wrapping up the banner. It's pretty much over at that point. Nick has a tremendous squeeze. He's very intelligent on the ground from what I've heard, because I don't know what's going on the ground for the most part. I just know when guys go to the ground with Nick, they start to look like this. They start to panic a little. Nick is a very Calculated, calm, cool. He kind of reminds me of Spicoli, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Both these guys are very young. Tom and Nick are a little more contrast in their fight styles. Tom looks a little more like a little more. He's long in the division, but Tom a little more touch and go. And then when he has to sit down on power, he'll go for the gusto. It's almost like Rob and Calvin, Tom and Nick. Nick is a little more cool. Tom is a little more knock the door down with a sledgehammer. But they both have to do either or. Tom is really strong on the feet in terms of his range management. He has just in the jab. And his right hand is thunderous too. He's a hard puncher. His knee and elbow game is great too because he's taller and longer. Really excited to see how he flourishes. These guys are young too. They're very just not too much mileage on them. You know, Tom wrestled a lot when he was younger, and Nick's been doing jiu-jitsu at a high level since he was like 12 years old. Nick has some cool stories from being in the Blue Basement back in the day with like Danaher, Death Squad, and those guys. You know, and Tom's only really ever been around Tom and Calvin. So these guys have, and Rob and Calvin. Rob often those two. It's not that they're lucky, but that they're growing up in a better circumstance. Where you know, Rob, a lot of us in that younger era had to kind of stumble our way through a couple goofy coaches, bad training partners, and poor fight camps. Well, these guys have most of the stuff figured out right off the rip, and the people around them take care of them. Their support systems are awesome. The team cherishes them, and they're great training partners. On top of it, Nick almost all the jiu-jitsu duties for both Rob and Calvin.
Ooh, that's actually great because I remember Rob has a couple guillotines, right? Because when you mentioned the Brazilian with hard calf kicks and like flurries, I was just thinking of Douglas Silva de Andrade the whole time because that's just what that guy is in my head. But so that's actually pretty cool. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to those guys. Thank you.
Yeah, they're. I'm gonna say so. They both. So Tom's 3-1. Nick just hit his 5-0. You know, 24 years old. Sky's the limit for these guys. They're taking it nice and slow, making sure they're taking care of their bodies and getting the smart fights, as Tyson says.
Yeah, and clearly I don't have to worry about their camp.
Nope.
Thank you for joining me, everyone. Thanks for listening. So go check out these two newer guys, Rob and Calvin. Best of luck in their future fights. Thank you, and I'll see you guys later.